Scott is a unique individual. At 27 years old, which was 3 years ago, right? Started Sun Microsystems, and Sun changed our environment. It changed the way computing worked. It's one of the most successful IT companies ever. And I really look forward to, I appreciate him coming today. We're glad that he's out of the witness protection program to appear. Well, come on up, Scott, and share your wisdom with us.
Thanks, John. It's been a while since I actually had an introduction. Now that I'm formerly famous and important, I don't get the one that I used to get, which is, here's the guy who needs no introduction, Scott. Now I need an introduction, but it's always nice to get one. And thanks, Lonnie, for driving me in from the airport. That was much appreciated, and for sponsoring this. And Todd, thanks for all the organization and the effort here. It's always fun for me to be in front of developers. It's been a while since I've been in a room full of this many developers. Certainly at Weigh-In, we get them all together. There's about 15 of them. So, thanks to all of the sponsors. I really do appreciate that, especially since I didn't have to help recruit them this time. And it's also nice to have, besides it-ology, have sponsors like the city, and then there's a bunch of them: Rackspace, Verizon, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Google, Oracle. And I don't compete with any of them anymore, so that's awesome. I'm probably still going to nudge and jab a few of them because some old habits are hard to break, but it's all in good fun, and I don't have a dog in the fight, so it's all for fun. But most importantly, why did I spend 2 days of my life to come out to Columbia? I actually live on the left coast, very far left, bankrupt coast. But I digress. Why would I come out here and do this? Well, the open source community is near and dear to my heart, and I think you'll see as I act like an old guy and go through some history with you here today. It matters to me. I believe you are a very important technology army that is working for the good of all of us and doing really great things. I think it's very important that we continue to push and drive this. I'm disappointed there aren't 15,000 folks here. And that's where we need to get to. Back a long time ago, I used to co-host the largest, we at least called it that. We built it as the largest developer conference, and this was the largest open source developer conference. How many of you ever went to Java 1? So just a few of you. It was quite an event. Talk to the folks who were there. But we would fill Moscone. We would rent San Francisco. And it was a very, very big deal. And it was the big driver in the open source software community. I will say that I don't believe there's anything quite like Java 1 in the open source community right now pushing that, and that's a little bit unfortunate. So we've kind of taken a little bit of a hit. I will take the blame. I had 4 boys, and at the time they were 2, 4, 6, and 8, and I said to my board, I'm stepping down as CEO, and I'm not going to lead this charge anymore. And 6 years later, Oracle bought Sun. I lasted 2 days at Oracle, which I attribute to a paperwork snafu. And so the whole movement continues to do well. You all continue to contribute in amazing ways, and I really, really appreciate that. But I think it did take a little bit of a hit the day Oracle bought Sun, and I'll try and talk about that a little bit as we go forward, and that's sort of the title of my talk. Well, who's leading the movement now? And how is that going to play out going forward? And I know and I love the open source community attitude of we don't want a leader, we're an NGO. We are, just, what? It still needs a leader, and I'm not sure, I want to thank all of you who got on Weigh-In and voted on a bunch of stuff. I'm going to talk about some of the results. You can all go to the POSSCON channel on Weigh In and see how a lot of your peer group has voted on these issues. But in fact, we asked who was the iconic leader, and it was actually, unfortunately, quite unclear who is the face. It used to be Linus Torvalds, right? But or Linus. Nobody ever really knew which one was proper. Maybe part of the problem. But you know, who is the leader? And I think that's something this group needs to think about and try and figure out, and get on the blogs and get on Twitter and all the rest of it, and get somebody in some organization to lead. And I'll talk about why I think that's important. But I'm going to share with you, you know, some of the results on Weigh In that are sort of germane. Some of it is and isn't. But 80% say cloud is not a threat to open source. 91% say it's proper to make money using open source. But we'll see if we can pull that off in the industry. Certainly Sun was able to build a model that worked well. I used to say I was a good capitalist, but you know, quite honestly, Larry Ellison was a great capitalist. So what's better, good or great? So let's move on to the talk. Now, there were a lot of things I could talk about here, and certainly cloud is one of them, but it seems to me I talked about that a lot. A long time ago, I said the network is the computer. Why didn't I just say cloud? And we could have saved a lot of words. But you know, social networking is big, and I've started a new company out in Denver called Weigh In to go after the next wave of social networking. But and I always used to call, you know, social networking the digital tattoo that we all wear. And now I'm actually got my own tattoo parlor. I could talk about security. Well, why talk about that? You have none, get over it. Somebody said that a long time ago, and I think that turned out to be rather accurate. We could talk about sex in the office, but this is an Oracle open world. So it's great. I don't really, and I'm not in a public company. And so I thought we'd talk about open source software. I thought that would be an interesting topic. But before we got into all of that, I thought I'd do a top 10. I used to have an army of marketing folks who would help me with these, but I don't anymore, so you'll have to laugh whether they're funny or not. But I thought this would be an appropriate topic, the top 10 signs that your company should have used open source software. So the top 10 reasons. Number 10, Chapter 11 is cheaper than switching ERP vendors. We had spent $500 million to try and just move to the next rev of Oracle ERP when we got bought. The first thing Larry Ellison did when he got there was he shut the project down. Thought that was interesting. Why didn't you tell us before we spent $500 million? Number 9, Ballmer just joined your board of directors. A little hard to go totally open source now. Your CIO and the IBM CEO are on a billboard in Times Square together. You must be a good customer. All right, that one wasn't so funny. Number 7, more of your employees attended Oracle Open World than attended your all hands meeting. Number 6, a software vendor audit is scarier than an IRS audit. That's the beauty of, you know, free is very easy to audit. Number 5, software support pricing growing faster than a Pelosi budget deficit. That's fast. That's fast. So you actually believe IBM is going to release DB3 for the mainframe? It takes a lot of hallucinogens to believe that. Number 3, your Oracle rep laughs uncontrollably when you call to schedule contract negotiations. And he says, you mean contract explanation, not negotiation. Right. Number 2 reason, compared to Apple, you now think Microsoft is open. In fact, it's interesting on the way, and I asked one of the questions, I said, which is the most proprietary company of Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, and Apple? And Apple won resoundingly. 68% call them the most proprietary company out there, and I think that's kind of interesting. And then the number one reason you should have gone OSS is your enterprise license agreement just surpassed your corporate income tax payments and the Obama vacation budget combined. Huge, huge number. So there you have it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why you should go OSS, but first I want to do a little history. I asked who invented the internet, and 31% of you said Al Gore invented it. Either they're joking or they're raging Democrats, but I'm a raging libertarian. So anyhow, a couple of people wrote in that the government started it, and that's true, that ARPANET, was started by DARPA to create a networking scheme that could survive a nuclear blast in a particular city. You didn't want to have a hub and spoke thing where if the hub went down, you want to be able to reroute. And a key component of that was TCP/IP. And that was back in 1982. You have to understand what the networking landscape was back then. It was Token Ring from IBM, DECnet. You had Apollo Domain. I can always tell the age of people. The people go like this. The other people are, the young kids are going like this. Apollo Domain was probably the nicest networking scheme out there at the time, and the high volume one was IPX from Novell. And we started at Sun with TCP/IP because it was open sourced. It was free. No royalties. It was really cool. And we did Ethernet because Xerox had opened that up and made that free and open. And in fact, we were the first company to ever put TCP/IP on every computer we ever shipped. I think Microsoft got around to it in 1998 to give you an idea of when they finally figured out that the internet was happening. And so we started off with open source Ethernet, the multi-bus, VME bus, and eventually the S-bus, which we created in open source. So even the hardware buses were open sourced. I'll never forget, about a year into it, we had some DEC and DG executives on our management staff, and Bill Joy walks in and says, "We've invented NFS, Network File System." And he said, "We would like to, we're going to open source it." He said, "We're going to put it on the net and make it free." And the president who was from DEC said, "No, that's corporate jewels." That was the phrase everybody used for source code. Those are your corporate jewels. You don't expose those. You only show it under NDA and a life threat. And no, we're going to throw out that. And Bill's argument was, what good is it to have a network file system that only works with the 400 Sun workstations that are out there in the world? We want it to work and talk. A network file system is supposed to be just that, a network, not a local file system. We already had a local file system. That was LAN Manager, right? And everything that Microsoft did. So we had a big fight about it. The president lost, and we open sourced it, and NFS became a very big component of the next step of the internet on top of TCP/IP and Ethernet and all the rest of it. Sun OS was the first major open source project built off of Berkeley Unix. It was there was no really big open source operating system or even big open source project that happened out there. And that was quite successful and certainly took on a lot of people. We even open sourced the Spark architecture eventually. And we actually bought a chip company that took our open source architecture and created their own chips, and that became the UltraSpark T1, T2 process, the multi-core processor line based on open source. We also bought companies that did open source at Sun, Open Office, which this slideshow is running on. I'll prove that a little bit later. We bought MySQL, which I think is one of the big reasons Oracle bought Sun. Not for friendly reasons. And then we open sourced all of our middleware. and tools and a whole bunch of stuff. So big investment in open source. So I don't say that we invented it, but I certainly believe we pioneered it. And we were a big company doing that. We had a couple $1 billion R&D budget, and we were open sourcing most of it, which was pretty interesting. Now, why would we do that? I asked all of you, and you say the number one reason for doing open source is customization. That really wasn't our goal. And beware, customization is a double-edged sword. You're building your own Frankenstein. And you know, we could talk about that later in Q&A if you'd like. But the reason we did it is we were the underdog. We didn't have the resources. We needed help. And if we were going to beat Microsoft, we needed mankind on our side. And so we saw all of you as mankind who were willing to help us and make us successful. And that was the big reason. It was also a lower cost of selling. We didn't have the sales force that Hewlett-Packard or anybody else had back in those days, DEC and all the rest of it. And the beauty of open source is it was a free download. And you didn't have to send anybody out there. You just sent the code out. And because the code was open, your cost of support was lower because they probably understood the code better than we did at times. It was also a very effective way to skewer cash cows. And you know, Novell had a huge IPX revenue base. Well, TCP/IP took it on pretty nicely, and that was a nice way to skewer a competitor. The biggest one was obviously Open Office, going after Microsoft Office, which was by far and away, and maybe still is, the single most outrageous cash cow in the history of the computer industry. And I can't remember the math because I can't remember how many downloads we were doing, but we took the monthly downloads times the opportunity cost, the monthly downloads of OpenOffice times the revenue that Microsoft got, and it was somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion of opportunity cost per month of of pre-tax margin to Microsoft that we were costing them. So, you know, people used to think it was, you know, my comments, like Hairball and Monopoly and Balmer and Butthead and stuff. That wasn't what got them mad. Open Office got them mad, right? That was, I mean, that's even for Microsoft, that was a lot of money. So that was a reasonable strategy for going after people. It was also controversial. And controversial was good because if you tried to do the same thing as DEC and IBM and Hewlett-Packard with 1/1000th the number of employees, you were going to lose. So you had to have a controversial strategy. Open source was controversial. It was different. And it still is, by the way, in the computer industry. Granted, a lot of people are using it, but it's still quite a controversial strategy. And if you look at you know, being different, that was a great way and still is a great way to be different. It also gave me a lot of free PR. We didn't do a lot of advertising. I was kind of the quote machine back in the old days. I've changed. But that was our way of getting into the conversation. So there were a lot of really good reasons for us to use open source. And I believe as users and suppliers, every company needs to really explicitly address and figure out what their open source strategy is. And I don't know how many of you work for companies. We asked the company, does your legal department let you use open source? And actually there were quite a few of you who said yes, they do, but that's why you're here. It's the folks who aren't here because their legal department says you can't use open source, and that's a problem. And there are more of you who have that problem than, this was kind of a self-selected group here at POSSCON that said, yeah, my legal department actually let me come here. I'm consulting to a few large technology companies, and it is quite fascinating that the CEOs just really don't even think about sharing. I call it sharing. And what interfaces they're going to open, what implementations they're going to open, what contributions they're going to make, and there's just no corporate policy. It's all part of the make-buy decision. What do CEOs do? They decide what to make and what to buy. And I would argue that many of the CIOs that you all work for, or you are, and many of the CEOs that you work for, or you are, don't really think about that make-buy decision. And open source is automatically and has to be a core decision process, and it should be part of your core corporate strategy. So now, why is it so controversial? I'm not going to go into all of the myths. I've talked about, you know, some of the advantages, and everybody understands cost and all the rest of it. But the big myth is that it's unsafe. And, you know, I still run into people who just think it's not safe, you know, that the source code ought to be secret, and, you know, that your security is going to be safer if people can't see the problems in your code. Well, there are so many reasons why open source software is going to be more secure, mostly because it's looked at by everyone. It's not just looked at by Redmond or Armonk or your little startup or whatever. When you open source it, everybody looks at the code. And when you have a lot of people looking at the code, you're going to find the security breaches. And they're going to get debugged in pre-production in the early access versions before you go into production. So that's automatic. I always like the Trojan horse example. Imagine the Trojan horse had been made of glass. And they look out over the wall and they say, oh, there it is. Look at all those warriors who want to come in and kill us. Let's just roll the Trojan horse inside the city walls. If it had been made of glass, we'd have probably not let it in, huh? And that's the same with source code. It'll be a lot safer. And people say, well, I don't want them to see our secrets. The problem with secrets, and Whit Diffie, a Sun distinguished engineer for a long time, who invented, you know, the Diffie-Hellman public key encryption strategy, basically came up with the concept that security has to be public, not a secret. And the problem with secrets is humans. Humans are very, very bad about keeping secrets. And if there's a secret, they're going to tell somebody. Don't. How many times have you been said, here's a secret, don't tell anybody else? I promise not to tell anybody, so I'm just telling you. Has that ever happened to you in your life? It'll happen again. And the other problem is the bigger the secret, the harder it is to keep. And the bigger the secret, the bigger the security breach you're going to have. So the only way to go address security issues is to be absolutely open, transparent, and public with the source code so everybody can see it. And the government has a lot of data to prove this, and you can go look at all their statistics. It's online. And all of their code says that they have far fewer security breaches with open source code than they do with proprietary code. I used to tell every 1-star to 4-star that I would meet at the Pentagon, you know, you ought to be court-martialed for using anything other than open source code in defense of our country and when you put people in the line of fire. And they'd look at me like, that doesn't make sense, but I pushed that very hard. It's still a big issue, although people are starting to come around on that one. The other one is higher quality code. And I didn't really understand this one until we noticed that whenever we tried to open source something, the schedule would always slip. And we had pretty good engineers at Sun, guys like James Gosling and all the rest of it. But the reason it slipped is the engineers didn't want to be embarrassed. Why didn't they want? Well, because when you go out with open source, people see your code. They see the logic. They see how efficient your code is. They see how high quality it is, how secure it is, how well documented it is. It's like running around naked. Right? It's bikini season, right? So the engineers are all very, very careful with code that they're going to share with all of their peer group around the world. And it's interesting that that tends to drive far higher quality code. But it also creates another challenge, and one that also tended to delay our production schedules on open source code, and that is that indemnification matters. And you've all seen the fights that are going on out in the marketplace. We were involved in a few of them ourselves. But IP matters. Google and Oracle are having a fairly high-level Java conversation right now around intellectual property and Android. That's pretty interesting. You've seen some very, very major IP acquisitions. The Motorola IP was bought by Google. Nortel's IP portfolio was purchased by a consortium of folks, including Apple and others. I can't remember who else was involved in that, but these were hundreds of millions or multi-billion-dollar IP acquisitions. Now these were not to go build product. This was to basically arm up for patent wars. And this is probably the biggest issue, I think, facing most companies when they start thinking about open source is, you know, if they embed this in their product or deep into their systems or deep into their ERP systems, are they going to be subject to a patent issue, to an injunction? And when you get enjoined from using your ERP system, for instance, that's considered a big problem. So when we actually did open source code, we had to go line by line and document exactly the source, the origin, the author of each line of code, where we got it, who wrote it, when they wrote it, all the rest of it, and it was actually quite painstaking. You know, we had Sun OS, it was open source. We used the Berkeley source code, and then we wrote all the other stuff, so we felt very comfortable open sourcing it. I will tell you how Linux happened, in my view. This is revisionist history, all right? So I admit everybody has their own view of history, but we were doing Sun OS, and AT&T came along, and we had System 5, Release 3 out there, and then we had all of the other proprietary versions of Ultrix and AIX, and what was HP's called? HPUX. There's a good, clever name. So they created OSF, Oppose Sun Forever, but that was as a result of us merging the AT&T System 5 release with Sun OS that created System 5 Release 4. When we merged it, AT&T would not release the rights to us to open source System 5 Release 4. They didn't give us rights equivalent to ownership where we could actually go out and open source it. So all of a sudden, we went from Sun OS to Solaris, which was a better operating system, but it wasn't open. And for the next 6 or 7 years, we spent nearly $200 million, if I remember the numbers correctly, open sourcing. In fact, probably the most important piece was I went to Ray Norda when he was running Novell. In the last week of his reign there, he was getting ill and he was going to step down, and I flew out to Salt Lake and I said, listen, I need rights equivalent to ownership to the Unix license that Novell owned at that point. I said the only way we can go after Microsoft is to use the open source model, and System 5 Release 4, Solaris, I think we were at Solaris 6 or something at the time, isn't open sourceable. And he said, you know, he used to call him Pearly Gates and the Embalmer, so he was actually fairly sympathetic to the plight of Sun Microsystems going after Microsoft, and he wanted to leave a little bit of a legacy. So he, for $90 million, gave us rights equivalent to ownership on our Unix license, which was actually a very, very big deal at the time. And then we spent about another $100+ million designing out all of the code that we didn't have rights to open source and replacing it or buying out or whatever. And eventually we open sourced Solaris. I think it was 8 or 9. I can't remember exactly when we launched the open source version. But in that time, you all, the community, got restless of not having open source code, and Linux took off. And once the market had tipped towards Linux, that was a really big, huge issue. Now, during that time, that was the bubble, and we were doing really well, and we didn't know and weren't paying much attention. But there wasn't much else we could go do. We were going as hard and as fast as we could to open source Solaris. So a little history, that's how Linux got started. I will also say that if we had bundled Solaris on a standard x86 box, as opposed to trying to do Solaris on x86 as a software-only product. We would have slowed Linux down a little bit. But that's history. Anyhow, indemnification is a big issue. Everybody's going to have to pay attention. The big companies aren't interested in delaying their product to make sure that it's open sourceable. They don't like the delays that the engineers have with open source code. They don't like the thought that they might not make as much money on the software if they open source it. And the indemnification issues really scare them around taking code off the side of, some people have likened it to picking up a dirty needle off the side of the street. You don't know where it's been or where it came from. And the whole software patent issue is probably the biggest one hanging out over the technology innovation horizon. Only 22% of you, when I surveyed you on weigh-in, said that the software IP issue, software patent issue, is just fine. I'd like to know which 22% thought it was just fine. Might have been Oracle and IBM and some others, but it's a big issue, and I think the one that this industry needs to focus on the most. There's a pretty interesting kind of white paper, legal paper written by somebody on this whole issue and how the courts can help out here. I'll share the URL with Todd, and if any of you are interested in reading it, it's actually pretty good reading on the state of the industry and the law in this space. But this one needs to get fixed. Now, why else and should people use open source? I think you all know this, but the second most important is zero barrier to entry. It's free, you download it, you don't need a PO, you don't need your boss's approval. 98% of the places that open source ended up in production in a corporation happened despite, I should say in the situation of higher up ignorance. They just didn't know it was happening. You just brought it in, got the prototype up and running, got it debugged, did the interoperability and stress testing, and then went to the boss and said, hey, look, it works. And I didn't pay anything for it, and all we need is a support contract. Or you can go to the proprietary company and negotiate an enterprise license agreement. But that'll take a lot longer, because I've already done it. And that's how open source got in. You just snuck it in. Zero barrier to entry. And you only pay at the point that you really start generating revenue, and that's when you go into production. So it's a very, very nice model. And I'm just actually stunned that it isn't the way everybody does it. And people just get into old habits. I will tell you, there isn't a startup in the last 15 years that I can think of that is paying for software on a license agreement. They may be paying for support, but they're not paying for software. Certainly Weigh-In hasn't written a check yet for software. We pay a little support license to 10gen for MongoDB. We pay a little support license to, we learned our lesson around ERP, so we use Sugar. Pay a little support license there. All very affordable for a little startup, and it all works just fine. The bigger issue is, and I still don't hear people talk about this, is the barrier to exit. And I've talked about this for a long time. I've talked about, and by the way, it's true with services too. You can switch service as well as product with open source, because all of the exit roadmaps are right there. All the code is there. I used to call it the Roach Motel. You check in and never leave when you went into proprietary code, and boy, is that true. And the proprietary vendors know to price at $5 less than the barrier to exit, than the cost of exit. And that as you get bigger and older and more data in the proprietary system, the barrier to exit rises every year by at least 15%, even if you're only growing at 5%, because your data and your transactions are growing at a faster rate. And I guarantee you Safra Katz knows that. She's the one that negotiates or explains the new contracts to you at Oracle. I understand why consumers get locked into a Windows or an Apple environment because they have no buying power and they sort of have to go where the market tips. But CIOs with engineers and buying power have more ability to change the purchase order. And the purchase order should say, I want you to, here's my RFP. It is, I want to pay for somebody to bring this stuff in, train my people up, get it installed, get it operating, run it for 4 years, and then at the end of 4 years, move me to another platform. At your cost, at the vendor's cost, I want you to move me to another platform. And all RFPs should have at the end of the contract, you move me at your cost. So if you went to a Ford dealer and said, all right, I want you to train me up on the car. It takes about 5 minutes to say, there's the radio, there's the brake, there's the steering wheel, right? You don't need a new license. You don't need a new garage. You know, the install is very simple. You know, they just shine it up and give you the keys and say, push that button and it starts, right? And then at the end of the 5-year lease, they say, all right, here's a Chevy. I'm going to train you on the Chevy. They're more than willing to do this contract. They'll move everything out of the trunk of your car into the new car, right? And there's no new license required. The training will take less than 5 minutes. If you know how to drive a Ford, you'll be able to drive a Chevy. So they're happy to do that contract where they say, yeah, the exit barrier, they'll handle the exit barrier if you buy their Ford today. But imagine going to Microsoft and saying, all right, I'll buy your Office productivity suite, or to Oracle, I'll buy your ERP and database. But in 5 years, when the contract's done, I want you to move me over to SAP or to some other productivity suite. They would probably charge you a little bit more, wouldn't they? Right? And yet with an open source database, they would say, I won't charge you that much more because we can build a quick little filter to whatever database you want. Because we know the on-off ramps. The on-off ramps are there. Or if you want to switch service vendors, IBM can come in and say, yeah, I can support MongoDB because we got all the source code. I can read it, I can find the bugs, I can enhance it, all the rest of it. It's the zero barrier to exit. The problem is nobody in the IT space understands that the barrier to exit is 10x the barrier to entry of code. And all vendors know that the first hit of heroin is free or near free. And it's fascinating to me that the purchasing agents and the CIOs just don't seem to care. And that's the biggest hindrance you all have, is people don't explain that the barrier to exit, the cost of exit ought to be in the purchase price. And the vendors ought to be held to it. We would have done that in a heartbeat at Sun because we could have moved our stuff to anybody else's very, very quickly. Moving it from theirs to ours, you know, moving from a mainframe to a Sun environment isn't very easy, but moving from a Sun environment to somebody else's was very easy. We tried to get that to be an advantage, and in many cases it was very hard, which is why I'm here speaking to you today. Again, I would encourage you all to feature the zero barrier to exit a little bit more. I want to remind you, this is a new topic, I want to remind you of something that I think the industry has forgotten about. And we didn't really talk about it too much at the time because we didn't want to scare people. But there's 3 basic models, and there's lots of different shades in between of the 3 basic models. There's the proprietary model. Everybody gets this one. That's the Microsoft, the Intel, the IBM mainframe, and the Apple model today. And that is proprietary, our way or the highway, lock-in, huge barriers to exit, and at any moment in time, these companies have probably been the most valuable technology companies on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And right now, Apple is right there with $100 billion of cash that they don't know what to do with. Congress could figure that out. Then there, at the other end of the spectrum, there's the peace, love, and commune open source world. And I love all the vendors. The OpenStack.com, OpenSoftware.org. A lot of .orgs. The whole other end is .orgs and Fedoras and that sort of stuff. OpenOffice.org. And this is kind of what I call the church as opposed to the state, which is on the other side. And that's all great, no leader, NGO kind of a model. And we keep trucking along and gaining share in the marketplace. Sun actually introduced, I think quite uniquely, a hybrid model, which was called the Java Community Process. And that was sort of in between, and that was a benevolent dictator. I called it benevolent stewardship because dictator was, I was told by marketing that wasn't a very appropriate term. And the Java Community Process, people have forgotten about, but it was all very well documented, and some other big companies ought to grab it and run with it, because I would argue that the Java Community Process has been far more successful than any other open source licensing model or architecture or whatever than any others. Java is on everything, from smart cards to every high-end server. It's on all mobile devices. It was on the Mars lander, and we had 100% share of the Mars landers, both of them. But it was everywhere, and it's very, very solid code. I asked all of you what's the most important language in the open source community, and versus Ruby, Python, PHP, and Java. Java won resoundingly with 61% of your votes as the important open source language. And the reason why is we had a big company behind it who funded the church, who funded the .org piece, and was the fair and benevolent steward of the evolution. Now, we didn't lead every Java community process. In fact, IBM did J2EE with a whole bunch of other companies, and then gave us the technology back. We verified that it was compliant, put the coffee cup logo on it, and then licensed it back to everybody who invented it on a fair and equal basis, and took a fee to do that. Now, we didn't really make much money doing that, but we were at the head of the parade. We were in the front of the Java parade, which was a very powerful position to be in. And we could run Java 1, which was our best marketing event and branding event and promotional event we did every year. We had Motorola and Nokia and others do Java ME, which was Java on the phone. And we had Gemplu and Schlumberger and others do Java Card. And all around the world, we had hundreds of Java processes, and we had all of these competitors working together, inventing new implementations of Java, which they gave to us after running our compatibility test suite properly. And then they gave us rights equivalent to ownership. We would open source it and license it back to everybody for a fee, a branding fee, to say that it was Java compatible. So we ensured write once, run anywhere. That eliminated forking. In fact, Microsoft tried to fork. I don't know if you all remember, but we had a little legal run-in with them where they took about half a dozen or a dozen Java calls out of their VM. And then they added about 6 to 12 Windows calls into it and called them .java class calls and put that into their developer tool, so that if you wrote a Java application that ran on everything else, it wouldn't run on Windows because it would be missing 1 or 2 calls. And then if you used their developer tools, you started using Windows calls accidentally because they called them Java class calls, and then it wouldn't work on all the others. So we sued them, and it was just only probably the biggest settlement ever, $2.4 billion of cash and a whole bunch of other settlement issues. So as a benevolent dictator, we actually went in and protected the forking and the brand, the Write Once Run Anywhere Java brand, very aggressively. This process has created, I think, the most successful open source product in the world. Now, again, blame me. I had 4 boys, step back, and I think we sort of lost our focus on making money and being open source and a benevolent dictator, and Oracle bought us. And I don't know that sharing is Larry Ellison's default personality trait. So that really leads to, so why did I bring this up? I just think somebody ought to grab the whole concept of the Java community process and be that benevolent steward and start driving more pieces. There should be a benevolent steward for OpenStack, and it can't be openstack.org. They need to be there, but you need somebody big, strong, and that sort of leads up to, so who's going to lead the open source movement now that Oracle owns Sun? And I think it's pretty clear that there hasn't been a lot of huge progress other than a lawsuit against Google around Java in the last couple of years. And you know, it's all moving forward. You're all doing great, and don't give up the ghost here. Keep going. I implore you all, for my children, that you continue to do the great work. But think about it. Sun was a $2 billion plus R&D organization. That's top 40 in the world in R&D spending at the time. All industries, all technologies, aerospace, pharmaceutical. This is a major, major R&D company. And we were open sourcing most of our code from the UltraSpark microprocessor all the way up through OpenOffice and everything in between. That was a lot. We out-donated the rest of the planet, probably, in terms of R&D on open source. That's gone. The spiritual and financial and technical leader in the open source community is gone. And that's why there's only 700 people here instead of the 15,000 we would get at Java 1. I think that's part of the problem. Now, who's going to step up? Who's going to go drive and run the legal warhead here, or front man? Who's going to do the sales and support, the promotion? Is it going to be, I asked the question and you all said, well, IBM is the one who's donating the most or most likely to be the next leader. I don't know. I don't see the spiritual leader there. I think it needs, this community. It is a community, needs a little bit of charisma. I didn't mean that. I really didn't. I don't think it's Google. Google uses open source. They aren't really open. That's not their goal. I mean, they fake you out a little bit. I think a hardware company is a natural because free software monetized with support services and hardware. Hardware will never be free because you can't download a disk drive for free out over the internet. So there will always be an expectation that you got to pay for disk drives, DRAM, and microprocessors. But EMC and Hewlett-Packard would seem to be naturals to go do this. I just don't see Larry ever getting into this space. But somebody's got to take the lead, and I think that's the biggest question, along with indemnification in the open source community, and the biggest opportunity. So that's kind of my historical overview of how we got started and where we are today, and some of the challenges facing you. I just kind of wanted to load that up as you're all plugging away at your own little project or your own little area of the open source community. This is kind of a high-level macro overview. I wanted to do a couple of other things before I got into Q&A, and that is share with you some of the interesting open source projects that I'm involved in. Now, this is OpenOffice failing to execute properly on a on a, let me go back. Oh, I can't do it. Hang on a sec. Let me just hit escape, and I can't. My fingers aren't. I was going to show you the slide, but I can't do it. So I'll go back to the slide. So this is Chorus, Greenplum Chorus, running a Microsoft slide that doesn't work in OpenOffice. So I'll just talk to it. And that's because OpenOffice isn't getting the energy that it used to. Oracle's basically kind of dumped it. And so my free, I might actually have to go out and buy a productivity suite for the first time in my life. What's that? Really? And you think it'll fix this thing? Yeah, all right, well, give it more love, because Microsoft changes it as fast as they can to create exactly this problem, or they would share. But big data is a big challenge, and social media is the biggest data thing of all time, because they're tracking everything you do, every keystroke, every website, every sentiment, every intent, every action that you take, and it's creating massive environments. I was just involved with the Chorus launch with EMC and Greenplum. And what Chorus is technology to allow you to bring together the disparate databases, data types, data marts together, sort of like NFS brought file systems together. Chorus is trying to do that for big data and provide analytics and sandboxes to go test and analyze and do reporting on it. So they'll be open sourcing a whole bunch of the features of Chorus to allow for this interoperability across databases, across tools, across reporting. And in the second half of this year, you'll see them. They've launched a product. They haven't gotten the open source code done yet. I think the engineers don't want to get embarrassed again, and they are checking the IP issues. But at openchorus.org in the second half of this year, you will see some very interesting technology that I think could change as we move open source into the big data space. So here's another interesting product. Enterprise DB is launching their PostgreSQL product in the cloud, and they have not forked it. It's the same old Postgres database, but they do all of the provisioning, all of the scaling, and take advantage of whatever resources are available in the cloud automatically, so you don't have to do all those complex database administrator tasks as you develop applications using an open source database in the cloud. And the fact that they didn't fork lowers your barrier to exit. So I think that's a pretty interesting step forward in the world. And there's a lot of NoSQL stuff out there in the cloud world. Certainly we're using Mongo at Weigh-In, but that's a nice one. Here's another cloud company that has a portal and content management and social collaboration suite, LifeRay, and they just hit 550,000 downloads in just 3 months with their community edition. And you can see their community number is very large, and they're growing very nicely. I think you're going to see more and more of this happening out in the marketplace, more integration and more suites of software and cloud implementations. I particularly like LifeRay because they are a Weigh-In customer, and they're using Weigh-In as a one-to-many conversation piece to talk to these large communities. So they're, in the same way that I reached out to all of you on Weigh-In to get your feedback, they're going out to their customers, getting product marketing feedback, service feedback. They're doing polls, and they're doing education, voting, rating, all the rest of it, using the Weigh-In one-to-many conversation or client engagement technology. So now I'm going to do 2 last little advertisements and then open it up for Q&A. That's a nice lead-in to Weigh-In. It's a community building tool. Tweets are one-to-many broadcasts. Facebook is all about relationship status, as far as I can tell. The rest of it confuses me a little bit. And I think, by the way, they're struggling. Anybody who's looked, they did PHP instead of Java because it was quicker and easier and faster. But Java forces a lot of discipline, a lot of structure. I think they're going to have a really hard time. I think that's making changes. You can see the speed issues and all the rest of it that Facebook is facing. That's a major engineering task for that company. We use Java as our open source answer, MongoDB, and we run on Linux. We run on the Amazon cloud. Hopefully we will have to move off of that because it will just scale too quickly, but we're still early days on this thing. But we really are creating a very interesting conversation tool for people who want to have a one-to-many conversation with large communities. And there aren't any really great tools to go do that. You can try and do Google+, but after about 10 people, you run out of bandwidth and capabilities on the thing. So what we do is we use web pages or pictures or themes to evoke a conversation and then structure the answers back into a few set of categorizable and instantaneously calculated responses back. You know, if you go out on, if Lady Gaga goes out on Twitter and says, you know, what song would you like me to hear? What would you like to hear at my next concert? Somebody's going to have to go sort through all that stuff, and there's a whole cottage industry to figure out what sentiment is. We actually go out and ask for explicit intent. The heck with demographics and all the rest of it. You don't really care what the demographic is. If somebody says, I want to buy a belly putter this summer, you don't really care how tall they are, what sex they are, where they live, or whatever. You don't care any of that. I know their IP address. I know they want to buy a belly putter. I know who to call to sell access to that person. And so this is a really interesting step forward. Everybody's all clever and grabbing inferred sentiment and therefore implied intent by doing all this huge cottage industry of analyzing Twitter feeds and keywords and reading your Google email and all the rest of it. We just decided the heck with it. We'll go ask you. And we'll make it so easy for you to answer, you just will. Are you going to buy a belly putter? Nope. Next question, right? So we'll see if this works out, but it's an interesting play and might be an interesting way for you all to have a conversation with your employees, with your customers, with your suppliers, with your partners, and with your open source communities like LifeRay is doing. Now the last piece of it is, so I'm chairman of Weigh In and the largest investor, and we started it in Colorado because California is the most hostile work environment in the non-free world too, I think. But the one that I've been doing for a long time is Curriki, and I always want to put this in front of you, and it has an interesting way-in tie-in. Curriki is kind of the open source open source site of K through 12 educational materials. We spend $15 billion a year in the United States, every year, annually, once a year, on K through 12 educational materials, including $130 for a third grade math textbook when nothing's changed since Newton got hit on the head with an apple. And 10 plus 10 was, is, and will be 20 for a long, long time. Now, my sons all drag suitcases around with rollers to carry this $130, paperweight around. And I've never seen anybody read a textbook, stand up and cheer and go, yes! Or get excited and say, Dad, can I stay up a little longer reading this textbook? Now, what's wrong with that textbook? It's not multimedia. It's not web-enabled. It's not real-time scored. It's not online. It's not digitized. It's not high-res. And most importantly, it doesn't have leaderboards. Is there anything your kids do that doesn't have leaderboards anymore? I mean, they may do some things, but those are hobbies. But things that matter to them, I mean, and if you want to see the kid jump up and down, can you imagine a video game without a score, real-time score, without a leaderboard? Like, when does that happen? And so what we've done with weigh-in is we put leaderboards in on everything so that there's many different kinds of questions, but a predictive question is a gaming question. It's called gambling outside of the U.S. We call it gaming here in the U.S. to stay legal. But test questions are also, have a right or wrong answer, but right away, so we can actually grade questions on weigh-in. So what we're going to do is we have 46,000 learning assets on the Curriki website that have been donated, open source, free and open source. Even the Khan videos, Khan put them on here because YouTube is blocked in many schools because there's some nasty stuff. We curate everything, and it's a safe site, so we're a great place to go do that. We've had over 6.5 million visitors to the site. We have 3.5 people working at the organization. Trickle-up poverty has really destroyed the investor and charitable class big time. So we've kind of had to go on a shoestring, but we've been quite successful getting out there in the marketplace. We're adding 500 to 1,000 new registered users every day. It's about half U.S., half international. We're going to take weigh-in, and so if you get to chapter 3, we're going to embed 5 to 10 weigh-in questions. What's 1 plus 1? What's 2 times 4? And we'll have multiple choice answers, and we'll grade them. And the teachers can drag and drop those questions to their channel, to their students, and say, I'm going to close the poll tonight at 10 o'clock. You better have your homework done by 10 o'clock. At that point, I'll grade it all. I'll just hit the grading button. You'll see what your score was. And she'll have leaderboards the next morning of how everybody did, that everybody got number 7 wrong. She'd better redo fractions. Johnny got them all wrong. Better get him a tutor, and Mary is ahead of everybody semester to date on her homework. And she won't have had to do a thing other than automatically hit the button at 10 o'clock to close the poll and grade it and get our leaderboards. We think we can change education massively by bringing this real-time scoring leaderboard weigh-in. Think of it as a conversation. We also have teachers using, there's a BU professor who actually uses weigh-in to evoke the conversation, sort of like how I did, but she uses it much more aggressively. So you thought this was the reason why the Civil War started, so she'd call them in class, and then she'd get the debate going between the people who said this was the reason versus the people who said that was the reason the Civil War started, and it's totally changed the way people engage. She said her class participation rate had skyrocketed, and it turned not into a lecture, which I'm doing here to you, but rather a conversation, a one-to-many conversation, which is very powerful. So very excited about these 2 projects, and excited that they can actually help each other. So I'm going to leave you all with a call to action, and I think the first one is obvious, and I don't know how you guys are going to do this, but you need a big corporate leader. You need a big R&D company, probably a hardware company with services. And you all ought to just go cozy up to them. You ought to figure out, get on weigh-in, vote who you want to go after, and then occupy IBM or occupy EMC and just go sit down with the CEO. I'll go with you, if you'd like, as kind of your negotiator. But let's go occupy a big company and say, we want to anoint you. We want you to drive the EMC community process or the HP community process. We all want to get behind you, but you're going to have to be a benevolent steward, not a rip-off artist. And I think we can go in and train somebody up. I'd like to see that happen. I'd be happy to help you. It's a call to action. I'm busy. If you don't need me to do that, that's fine. If you can find somebody else to go do it, that'd be even better. But I think this would be something that would be helpful if you could get somebody to go do it. Keep going after. It's easy, just go look at the stock market to figure out where the biggest proprietary pockets are. I think Apple is the biggest one. Help save me. I miss my Sunray. I'm using a Mac. It's terrible. The world can do better, and you can do better. We need to save the consumer. ERP is, to book an order and to get to SOX compliance is the most expensive software product every company faces. Go sugar. everybody help everybody else on getting out from under the hairballs called ERP. It's not right. And then the other call to action is register and weigh in. So that's my prepared talks, and I'm much happier to get into a conversation with you all and answer any questions, comments, or thoughts on any topic that you may have. So can we turn up the house lights so I can... All right. It's hard to see out there with the retina burners. Questions?
Why don't you think Red Hat would be a good leader considering their earnings they reported yesterday?
I think Red Hat would be a great leader if they can get into the multi-billion-dollar R&D spend. I think the R&D, I think they certainly have the volume and a brand and all the rest of it, but you need somebody who's going to donate a huge amount of R&D to the effort. And I don't know what Red Hat's R&D budget is, but I don't think it's in the multi-billion-dollar range yet, because that's who you're competing with. That's who you're battling, are people with very, very large R&D budgets. Sure.
My question is that the Java community process shows that when the dictator is benevolent, it works, and it works exceptionally well. But you run the risk of it going disastrous when the dictator stops being benevolent, or the assignment of that dictator role is given to someone who does not take the benevolent area. How do you protect against something like that when basically you're calling the entire open source community to basically assign someone based on trust?
Yeah, so we didn't get the whole open source community to follow Sun. And in fact, Red Hat was pretty anti-Sun. So it's not like any single major player is going to, because this community, there's a whole bunch of you that are totally not totally NGO. You're never going to affiliate with any, all authority is bad, and that's okay. I'm cool with that. That's good. I think you need all three answers. You need I'm not saying don't do proprietary. I'm not saying eliminate software patents. I believe in patents. If we don't have patents, then you're not going to get the R&D investment in a lot of spaces, and I think that's important. People say, we shouldn't have drug patents. No, that'll kill people. It's important to have drug patents so that people can go through the multi-billion-dollar drug discovery process and deliver new drugs. They won't do it if there's no intellectual property patent, if there's no chance to make a return. So I believe in proprietary. I also believe in the NGO kind of peace, love, and commune thing. But I think what's missing right now, and that would help the cause, is having a big leader drive a big piece of it. Maybe it's OpenStack, maybe it's big data, or maybe it's whatever. But it raises the level, it raises the credibility, it raises the momentum. It gives, you have bigger conferences, you have more networking. All good things happen. And the unfortunate piece is that, and the reason why I want it to be a big company, Larry will just buy Red Hat if you all get behind Red Hat. Or maybe Apple will. They could buy Red Hat, and the shareholders would be out of there like that. You need a big company, one that bigger than Sun, because Sun got bought.
Is this on? Thank you for coming to speak to us, and thank you for your time. My question is, I actually heard this in one of the talks yesterday about opening up prisons with open source software. One of the reasons big companies or government agencies are hesitant to adopt open source software is because there's no specific vendor to blame or assign responsibility to. How would you address that?
So Sun actually understood that, and we were one of the few vendors out there who actually indemnified our open source code. And that's why we took so long to go through all that. Hewlett-Packard and IBM didn't indemnify you for Linux, didn't indemnify you for any other open source code. They wouldn't take that on. We had a huge patent portfolio, and we actually took the bullet. In fact, I got to say I wasn't terribly upset when Kodak filed for bankruptcy, because they became a patent troll in their old age when they were unsuccessful, and they came after us. And a retiring, going to retire Rochester judge threw a total bone to the city of Rochester by just absolutely butchering a case and forcing us to pay a big bag of money to protect the Java products and our customers from 3 patents that were just ridiculously inappropriate and applied. But the judge didn't care. He wanted to make sure Rochester and Kodak got a big influx of capital by suing us. We took that bullet. We took that we indemnified the Java users and took that bullet. That's why you need big companies to help drive these open source strategies, and who are strong enough to withstand that. And then hopefully good things like Kodak bankruptcy will happen eventually. They deserved it. I can say that now. I'm feeling better already. Any other questions? Yes?
What's your favorite text editor?
What's my favorite text editor? VI. You don't even know what that is.
All right.
He's from Mississippi. What would he know, right?
All right. Here's the deal. Rarely do you get to discuss heroin, the Civil War, Libertarian, Occupy, IBM, Trickle Up Poverty, and Pearly Gates, and then Bomber.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Okay.
Can I sit down now?
Hold on. Okay. Students, do me a favor. Come talk to this guy. He is a giant. Get your picture made with him. Learn from him. Seriously, this is a great conference because we have guys like this come and share the realities of the business side of it. So thank you all again for putting on this incredible event. We've got some great breakout sessions. Again, we'll do lunch in the Birds of a Feather. And thank you, Scott. That was entertaining.
Appreciate it.
All right. Get out of here.